All right, so buckle up, everyone, because today we're diving into something pretty radical.
Oh, I like radical.
Yeah, well, we're going to be looking at this book, the DOGE Directive. Right?
Okay, yeah.
Trump, Musk, Ramaswamy, and RFK's blueprint for a leaner government. It's all about how these four kind of unexpected figures, I guess you could say, want to, completely change the U.S. government. A total makeover.
You're not kidding. A total, from the ground up kind of thing. What gets me is the scale. They're not messing around with small changes here.
Yeah, and it's this wild mix of people, too, right?
Totally.
You've got, Donald Trump, former president, businessman, loves Twitter. Then there's Elon Musk, always pushing the boundaries with tech. And you've got Vivek Ramaswamy, he was in biotech. And now he's taking on, all the bloat in government, right?
Right. He's all about efficiency.
And then the curveball, RFK Jr., the environmental activist. So it's how did these four even end up in the same room, let alone writing a book together?
Right. It is a very curious alliance. But the book, it does explain what brings them together. They all believe that the government has become too big, too inefficient, and it's basically stifling innovation.
Okay. So they want to shake things up.
Big time.
And their solution is the DOGE Directive, right?
Right.
Not the cryptocurrency, though.
Definitely not the meme coin this time.
We're talking about the Department of Government Efficiency. They want to bring what they see as the speed and smarts of the private sector, like Silicon Valley almost, to how the government works.
Yeah, that's their big idea. And they take it pretty far. They've got this idea for a waste leaderboard.
A waste leaderboard. What is that? Like some kind of reality show for government agencies?
Kind of. It would rank publicly how efficient all these agencies are so everyone can see who's wasting money. It's meant to, shame them into doing better, I guess.
Well, that's pretty bold.
Yeah.
Do you think it would work? I mean, could a leaderboard actually make these agencies improve?
Well, it definitely fits with their whole push for transparency and accountability, letting the public see what's going on.
Right.
But would it actually lead to real change? That's a good question. Some people would probably say it's just for show, not actual reform.
Okay, so let's back up a bit. How did this group even get together? What's the common thread besides this frustration with government?
The book really focuses on that frustration, yeah. They all see themselves as these disruptors shaking up the system. Each of them has a different background, right?
Right, totally different.
But they're united by this goal of making government leaner, more streamlined.
I get their frustration with bureaucracy. I think everyone does. But isn't there a risk of going too far? What about those services people really depend on? Could this lead to cuts that hurt people?
That's a really important point, and the book does address it.
Okay, good.
They argue that it's not about dismantling essential services, but making them work better. But you're right, it's definitely a tricky balance to strike.
So they want a leaner government. How do they actually propose to make that happen? What's this DOGE department all about, really?
They see it as the central hub, injecting that private sector energy into the whole system.
Interesting.
They've got this multi-pronged approach starting with, you guessed it, the national debt.
Oh, yeah, that old chestnut.
Always looming. So they propose spending cuts, entitlement reform, and policies to boost economic growth. Plus, they want to attract more foreign investment.
Okay, so it's ambitious, I get that, but there have been plenty of times when big economic reforms have backfired. What are they doing to, protect against that, make sure things don't go sideways?
Yeah, they do talk about that. They stress that it needs to be done carefully, step by step, and they really emphasize using data to make decisions and track the impact of each change. So, no rash decisions.
Okay, that makes sense. Data and a gradual rollout. Yeah. But what about the specifics? When they talk about spending cuts, which areas are they looking at? Any examples?
Well, they don't give a detailed list, which is kind of interesting and probably a bit frustrating for some people.
Yeah, I can imagine.
But they do say they want a full review of all government programs to figure out which ones are inefficient or redundant. That's going to be a big debate for sure.
For sure. Okay, so we've got the spending side. How about stimulating economic growth? What policies are they talking about?
Tax reform is their big focus there.
Yeah.
They want to simplify the tax code, maybe even with a flat tax or a consumption-based system.
A flat tax? Whoa, I can already see the headlines. What are the arguments for and against that?
Well, people who like the idea of a flat tax say it's fairer, simpler, and harder to cheat on.
Makes sense.
But critics say it would help the wealthy more than anyone else and could hurt social programs. It's a complex issue, for sure.
Yeah, a flat tax is a big change. What about a consumption-based tax? How would that even work?
Basically, you'd be taxed on what you spend instead of what you earn, like a national sales tax, you know? The idea is that it encourages people to save and invest more. But of course, some folks argue that it would hit lower income people harder because they spend more of their income on basic things.
Okay, so we've got spending cuts, tax reform. What's the third part of their plan for the national debt?
Attracting foreign investment, big time. They want to make the U.S. really appealing for foreign businesses, which could create jobs and boost economic growth, at least in theory.
Okay, that makes sense on the surface, but isn't there a risk of becoming too dependent on foreign money, like giving up too much control?
That's a good point. They don't really dive into the potential downsides of that in the book, but it's definitely something to think about.
All right, so they've got a plan for the debt. What's next on their list for making a leaner government?
Next up is cutting all that red tape, all those regulations that businesses always complain about. DOGE wants to make those regulations clearer, simpler, and easier to follow, especially for small businesses.
That sounds good in theory, but how do you make sure that important safety and environmental rules don't get tossed out in the process?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And honestly, the book doesn't really give a clear answer on that one. It's this tricky balance between helping businesses grow and keeping people and the environment safe. I'm sure that would be a huge point of contention.
Yeah, I can see that. All right, so we've got the debt, the regulations. What's the third big part of their lean government plan?
This is where it gets really interesting and maybe a little sci-fi. Using technology to make government work better.
Okay, we talked about the waste leaderboard before. What other tech ideas do they have?
Lots. They want to use technology to automate a lot of government functions. Things like processing applications, managing data, all that stuff.
Okay.
And they really push for data analytics, using data to find waste and inefficiency. Musk even has this idea for a federal transparency portal where you could see all government spending and performance, like in real time.
A federal transparency portal. So like a live feed of where our tax dollars are going. Wow, that's pretty radical.
Definitely. The idea is to make government data way more accessible and understandable to everyone.
That sounds good, but would it actually make a difference?
It could. It's a step towards more transparency, at least.
Transparency is important. Okay, so we've got these big ideas, but who are the key players driving them forward? Let's start with Donald Trump. How does the book portray his role in all of this?
They paint him as this unconventional leader, someone who speaks directly and is very focused on results.
Okay, yeah, that tracks.
And they highlight how he appointed Vivek Ramaswamy as a key advisor for regulatory reform, which is a pretty big deal.
Definitely suggests Trump sees something in Ramaswamy's ideas. Now, what about Elon Musk? I can't imagine him sitting quietly in meetings.
You're telling me? The book focuses on his tech-driven approach. He's the one pushing for that total digital transformation of government, seeing technology as the key to making it more efficient and innovative.
That sounds like him. And speaking of shaking things up, let's move on to Vivek Ramaswamy. His whole thing seems to be targeting waste, right?
Absolutely. He's all about civil service reform, making those processes more efficient, and streamlining how the government buys things. He's really into data-driven approaches, which fits perfectly with DOGE's whole emphasis on using tech to find and eliminate waste.
So you've got Trump leading the charge, Musk bringing the tech vision, and Ramaswamy with the efficiency hammer. What about RFK Jr.? His involvement still feels like the biggest curveball to me.
It is surprising, but the book explains that he's mostly focused on government accountability and transparency. He's worried about special interests having too much influence, and he sees DOGE as a way to fight back against that.
All right, so we've got our team and their big plan. It all sounds fascinating, but let's be real. Completely overhauling the U.S. government like this, it's got to be a long shot, right?
Oh, absolutely. They don't sugarcoat the challenges. There are big concerns about data security, people losing their jobs as things get automated, and making sure everyone can actually access and use these new digital systems.
Yeah, those are all valid points. It sounds like the DOGE directive, even in the book, is presented as something with both huge potential benefits and huge potential risks. It's a lot to think about.
It really is. And the book doesn't pretend to have all the answers. It encourages readers to think critically about both the potential rewards and the risks of such a radical change. It's really thought-provoking read.
So it's less of a how-to manual and more of a what if we really shook things up kind of thought experiment.
Exactly. It's challenging the status quo, making us think about what the role of government should be in this century.
That's a great point. Before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, let's touch on the historical comparisons they make in the book. They talk about Margaret Thatcher, right?
They do. They compare DOGE to Thatcher's reforms in the UK, especially her efforts to shrink the government. But they also acknowledge that her legacy is complicated. She did some good things, but there were also a lot of controversies.
Right. Thatcher's reforms had a big impact, both good and bad. It seems like they're trying to learn from her approach, both the successes and the mistakes. What other historical inspiration do they mention?
Well, they also talk about the Grace Commission, which was put together by President Reagan back in the 80s to figure out how to make government more efficient.
I vaguely remember that. Didn't they come up with a bunch of recommendations that nobody really paid attention to?
Pretty much. The book argues that the Grace Commission, even though it had good intentions, didn't really achieve much because it focused on making small changes within the existing system.
And they see DOGE as a much more radical approach.
Totally. They're talking about dismantling whole systems and rebuilding them from scratch, not just tinkering around the edges. They believe that real transformation requires bold action.
So it's not just about trimming the fat. It's about a complete overhaul. That's a pretty radical vision. But it also raises the big question, can it actually work?
That's the question we'll be exploring in our next segment. We'll delve deeper into the potential impact of the DOGE Directive and whether it could truly be the catalyst for a new era of American governance. All right, welcome back, everyone. Last time, we dug into what makes the DOGE Directive so, well, different, where it came from, this big goal of a super efficient government, and the kind of unlikely group behind it all.
Right. We talked about them wanting to streamline everything, cut waste, and they even have that waste leaderboard idea, which is pretty wild.
Yeah, definitely attention grabbing. But this time, let's dig into what the book says about what this radical plan could actually mean, what impact it could have.
Okay, so they paint this picture of a totally revitalized U.S. economy. Lots of innovation, businesses booming, especially small ones, and overall, a better quality of life for everyone.
Right, that's the idea. But let's be real. Big economic changes can have all sorts of unintended consequences. History's full of examples. What do they say about protecting against that, making sure things don't go off the rails?
Yeah, good point.
Well, they do acknowledge that, you can't predict everything. They stress that any changes would have to be rolled out slowly in phases so you can adjust along the way. And they're really big on using data, constantly analyzing the impact of each change.
Okay, so data and a gradual approach are key. But even with that, some people are going to be worried. What are some of the downsides they talk about?
They bring up some important ones. One is jobs. What happens as agencies become more streamlined and automation takes over certain tasks. There's also the risk that it could make existing inequalities worse, and they talk about that. Plus, not everyone has easy access to technology or the skills to use it, so they address that too.
Right. Those are all big issues. What about data security? Putting so much information on digital platforms, isn't that kind of risky?
Yeah, it definitely is. And they talk about the need for really strong cybersecurity measures to prevent breaches. They propose this whole multi-layered approach with encryption, secure storage, and regular audits.
So they are taking data security seriously.
Yeah, they seem to be.
Yeah.
But overall, it's clear they think the benefits of a more efficient and transparent, data-driven government outweigh the risks. But that's a debate that's not going away anytime soon.
Right. There's a lot to weigh. It sounds like this DOGE directive is kind of like a double-edged sword, right?
Yeah.
Big potential for good, but also big potential for problems.
It definitely is. The book really pushes you to think hard about both sides, the potential rewards and the risks. It doesn't give easy answers, which I appreciate. It makes you question some pretty fundamental stuff about how government should work in this day and age.
That's a good point. Okay. You mentioned earlier that they compared DOGE to Margaret Thatcher's reforms in Britain. But those had mixed results, right?
Right. Thatcher's policies are often credited with helping the UK economy, but they also caused a lot of social and economic disruption. The book acknowledges that, pointing out both the successes and the controversies of her approach.
So they're trying to learn from the past, both the good and the bad. What other historical examples do they talk about?
They also bring up the Grace Commission, which was created by President Reagan back in the 80s. The goal was to find ways to make the government more efficient. Kind of similar to DOGE, actually.
Yeah, I vaguely remember that. Didn't they come up with a whole bunch of recommendations that were basically ignored?
Pretty much. The book argues that the Grace Commission, even though it was a good idea, ultimately didn't achieve much because it focused on making small changes within the existing system.
And they see DOGE as taking a much more radical approach.
Exactly. DOGE is about dismantling those old systems and building something entirely new, not just tweaking things around the edges. They believe that real change requires bold action, not just incremental steps.
So it's not about making the government a little bit better. It's about a total transformation. Okay, I get that. But that makes me wonder, how do they actually plan to do all this? It all sounds very theoretical.
That's where it gets really interesting. They lay out specific strategies and initiatives focusing on how DOGE would tackle the national debt, cut back on all those regulations, and, of course, use technology to revamp everything.
Okay, let's break it down. First up, the national debt. What's their big solution there?
They propose a three-pronged attack, cutting programs they see as unnecessary, reforming entitlement programs, and making changes to the tax code to stimulate economic growth.
Okay, that sounds like a familiar playbook. Cut spending, grow the economy. But the details are everything, right? How do they plan to make those cuts without causing major disruptions, to things that people actually need?
That's where it gets controversial. The book doesn't actually provide a list of specific programs they'd cut, which I'm sure will make some people nervous.
Yeah, I can see that.
They advocate for a complete review of all government programs to figure out which ones are inefficient, redundant, or just not working anymore.
That sounds like a recipe for some serious political battles. Okay, what about their plan for boosting economic growth? You mentioned tax reforms.
Right. They argue that simplifying the tax code is crucial for making the economy grow faster. They suggest two main options: a flat tax or a consumption-based tax system. Both are sure to be pretty controversial.
Let's start with the flat tax. How would that work, and what are the arguments for and against it?
So, a flat tax would basically get rid of most deductions and tax everyone at the same rate, no matter how much money they make. People who support this idea say it would make the tax code a lot simpler, reduce the burden on taxpayers, and help the economy grow.
Okay, so it has its appeal. But what are the downsides?
Well, critics worry that it would mainly benefit the wealthy and could lead to cuts in important social programs. It's a complicated issue with strong arguments on both sides.
Yeah, a flat tax is a big change, that's for sure. What about this consumption-based tax system? How would that be different?
With a consumption tax, like a national sales tax, you'd pay taxes based on what you spend, not what you earn. The idea is that it would encourage people to save and invest more. But of course, there are concerns that it would hit lower-income people harder because they tend to spend a larger portion of their income on essentials.
Right, so potentially more aggressive. Okay, we've got spending cuts and tax reform. What's the third part of their plan for dealing with the national debt?
They also talk about attracting more foreign investment. The idea is to create a business environment that's so attractive that foreign companies will want to pour money into the U.S. That could create jobs and boost economic growth, at least in theory.
That makes sense, but I wonder if there are any downsides to that approach. Could it lead to a loss of control over key industries?
That's a good question, and honestly, they don't really address those potential downsides in much detail. It's always a balancing act between attracting foreign investment and protecting your own interests. But it's definitely something to think about.
Okay, so we've covered their ideas for dealing with the national debt. What about their plan for cutting regulations? How do they propose to get rid of all that red tape that businesses complain about?
Well, they want to go through all the existing regulations with a fine-tooth comb and streamline them, make them clearer, more concise, and easier to follow.
Easier for everyone or easier for businesses?
They especially focus on making things easier for small businesses. They talk about reducing paperwork and making the whole rulemaking process more flexible.
That all sounds good for businesses, but what about protecting consumers and the environment? Wouldn't streamlining regulations make those things weaker?
That's a valid concern, and to be honest, they don't really give a clear answer on how they'd balance those competing interests.
That seems like a big gap.
Yeah, it definitely is. It's a tough question, and it's sure to be a major point of contention. They do mention using technology to improve how regulations are enforced, which could help mitigate some of the risks, but it's still a tricky issue.
Okay, so using tech to enforce better. That's an interesting idea. All right, we've talked about their plans for the debt and for regulations. What's the third big piece of their lean government vision?
This is where their tech-savvy side really comes out. They want to use technology to make the whole government run more efficiently, kind of like a well-oiled machine.
Okay, we've already touched on that with the waste leaderboard and that federal transparency portal idea.
Mhm.
What other tech solutions do they propose?
Oh, they have a lot. They talk about automating all kinds of government functions, everything from processing applications and permits to managing data and even delivering services. They're really big on using data analytics to find and eliminate waste, fraud, and inefficiency. It's like they want to turn the government into this data-driven powerhouse.
It's a pretty radical vision for sure. But isn't there a risk of becoming too reliant on technology? What if those systems crash or get hacked?
Yeah, that's a legitimate concern. And they do talk about the need for strong cybersecurity measures and backup systems, just in case. They believe the potential benefits of a more efficient and transparent government are worth the risks. But it's a debate that's likely to continue.
It definitely is. Okay, so we've talked about their plans, but let's talk about them, the people behind this vision. What are their motivations? Why are they so passionate about making these radical changes?
Well, the book suggests they're driven by this shared belief that America is exceptional, the best country in the world, but that has lost its way a bit. They see themselves as these disruptors trying to shake things up and restore America to its former glory.
That's an interesting perspective. So they see DOGE as a way to revitalize the whole country, not just the government. But do they talk about how this would actually benefit ordinary people?
They argue that a leaner, more efficient government would mean lower taxes, a stronger economy, and a better quality of life for everyone. They envision a future where people have more freedom and opportunity, and where businesses can thrive without being bogged down by all that bureaucracy.
Okay, that all sounds pretty appealing. But would those benefits really reach everyone? Or would some groups end up worse off?
That's a key question, and to be honest, they don't really delve into that in much detail. Some critics would argue that their focus on efficiency and free markets could actually worsen existing inequalities. It's definitely a conversation worth having.
It seems like there are a lot of potential outcomes, both good and bad. It's a lot for our listeners to think about.
It really is, and the book doesn't shy away from that complexity. It encourages readers to think critically about the potential costs and benefits and to have those tough conversations about the future of government.
Hey, before we move on, I'm curious about their views on education. Do they have any proposals for reforming the education system?
Yeah, they're big proponents of school choice. They want to give parents and students more options, things like charter schools and voucher programs.
So basically, introduce more competition into the system.
Exactly. They believe that competition will push schools to improve and ultimately benefit all students.
School choice is a pretty controversial issue. What are the main arguments for and against it?
Well, people who support school choice say that it empowers parents and students, gives them more control over their education, and encourages schools to innovate.
Okay, so more freedom and innovation. What do the critics say?
Critics worry that it could take resources away from public schools and make the inequalities in the system even worse.
Right, so it's another one of those issues with valid points on both sides. What about healthcare? That's a huge issue in the U.S. How would DOGE approach healthcare reform?
They want to bring down costs and give people more control over their healthcare decisions. They talk about reforming Medicare and Medicaid and potentially moving towards a system of personalized health savings accounts.
Personalized health savings accounts. I haven't heard of that. How would that work?
It's an interesting idea. Basically, the government would put a certain amount of money into your account each year, and you could use that money to pay for your healthcare. The idea is to make people more cost-conscious and to encourage competition among healthcare providers.
Yeah, okay. So it's kind of like putting consumers in charge of their own healthcare. What are the potential downsides of that approach?
Well, some people worry that it would make it harder for people with pre-existing conditions or chronic illnesses to get the care they need. And there are concerns about whether everyone would have enough money in their accounts to cover their healthcare costs, especially if they have unexpected medical expenses.
So again, a system with both potential benefits and risks.
Exactly. And they also talk about environmental protection, which is interesting considering RFK Jr.'s involvement. They stress the importance of being good stewards of the environment, but they believe that the best way to achieve that is through market-based solutions and innovation, not just government regulations.
So less government intervention and more reliance on the private sector.
Right. They suggest streamlining environmental regulations and offering incentives for businesses to adopt sustainable practices. They believe that businesses are often more efficient and innovative than the government when it comes to environmental protection.
That's a pretty different approach than what we usually hear. What are the potential downsides of that?
Critics worry that weakening environmental regulations could lead to more pollution and environmental damage. They argue that relying on businesses to voluntarily do the right thing might not be enough, especially when it comes to climate change.
So once again, a lot of potential for both good and bad outcomes. It's a lot for our listeners to unpack.
It really is. The DOGE Directive presents a vision that's both exciting and a little scary. There's a lot of potential for positive change, but there are also a lot of risks. It's a vision that forces us to think hard about what we want the future of our country to look like.
That's a great point. Before we wrap up this part, I want to bring it back to our listeners. We've talked about the big picture, but how could these changes actually affect people's lives? What would it mean for their day-to-day experiences?
That's a great question, and one that we're going to explore in more detail in our next segment. We'll dive into how DOGE's proposals could impact your taxes, your healthcare, your education, and the environment, so stay tuned.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've been talking about this, pretty radical vision for the future of the U.S. government, the DOGE Directive.
Right, this idea of a leaner, more efficient government. We've covered a lot, the people behind it, what they want to achieve, the potential benefits, and of course, the risks.
We've talked about their plans for everything, from tackling the national debt to using technology to streamline government. We've even touched on some historical comparisons they make. But now, in this final segment, let's get down to brass tacks. What does all this mean for you, our listener? How could the DOGE Directive actually affect your life?
Well, the DOGE Directive, if it actually happened, would touch pretty much every aspect of American life. We're talking about healthcare, education, taxes, the environment, you name it. The changes would be massive, no doubt about it.
Okay, so let's break it down, starting with something everyone cares about, their money. What would a leaner government mean for your taxes?
Well, the book is really big on tax reform. They talk about simplifying the tax code, maybe even going as far as a flat tax or a consumption-based tax.
A flat tax?
That would
That's a pretty big change. How would that even work?
Basically, you get rid of most deductions, and everyone would pay the same tax rate no matter how much they make.
Okay, that sounds simple enough, but I'm sure some people would love it and some people would hate it.
Exactly. People who like the idea say it would be fairer, simpler, less paperwork, and harder to cheat.
Okay, I can see the appeal. What about the downsides?
Critics worry that it would mainly benefit wealthy people and could lead to cuts in social programs. It's a classic debate, fairness versus economic growth.
Right, a flat tax would be a huge shift. What about this consumption-based tax? How's that different?
So instead of taxing your income, you'd be taxed on what you spend, like a national sales tax, but on everything you buy.
Interesting.
The idea is that it would encourage people to save and invest more. But of course, there are concerns that it would disproportionately affect people with lower incomes who have to spend a bigger chunk of their money on necessities.
Okay, so potentially more regressive. So they've got ideas about taxes. What about healthcare? That's a big one for a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. They want to bring down the cost of healthcare and give people more control over their own decisions. They talk about changing Medicare and Medicaid, maybe even moving towards a system of personalized health savings accounts.
Personalized health savings accounts. What's that?
It's like this. The government puts a certain amount of money into an account for you every year, and you use that to pay for healthcare.
So it's kind of like a voucher system for healthcare.
Right. Supporters say it would give people more choice and encourage them to be more cost-conscious. But critics worry that it could create problems for people with pre-existing conditions or chronic illnesses.
Right, and what if your medical expenses are higher than what's in your account?
Exactly, that's another big concern. So there are definitely trade-offs to consider.
Okay, healthcare is a big one. What about education? How would DOGE change things there?
They're really big on school choice, things like charter schools and vouchers. They want to give parents and students more options and shake up the education system a bit.
Okay, so more competition, like in the private sector.
Exactly. They believe that competition will lead to better schools and better outcomes for students. But critics worry that it could hurt public schools and make existing inequalities in the education system even worse.
Right, so another controversial idea. What about the environment? How do they approach that?
They're all for protecting the environment, but they want to do it differently.
Okay, how so?
They emphasize market-based solutions and innovation instead of relying so heavily on government regulations. They'd streamline regulations and offer incentives for businesses to be more sustainable. They believe businesses can often be more efficient and come up with creative solutions that the government just wouldn't think of.
Okay, that's definitely a different approach. But what about the risks? I mean, aren't regulations there for a reason?
Critics worry that weakening regulations could lead to more pollution and damage to the environment. They argue that we can't just trust businesses to do the right thing, especially when it comes to climate change, which is a global problem that needs strong government action.
Yeah, that's a valid point. So it seems like this DOGE directive has the potential to change a lot about American life, in both good ways and bad. It's a lot to take in.
It really is. The book raises a ton of questions, and honestly, it doesn't provide all the answers, but that's kind of the point, I think. It's meant to make us think critically about the role of government, about the future we want for our country, and about what kind of society we want to create.
Yeah, it definitely gets you thinking. It's like a giant thought experiment, and it's up to us to decide what we think the results would be.
Exactly. And even if you don't agree with everything they propose, the DOGE directive is a really valuable exercise in thinking outside the box and imagining different ways of doing things.
It's a reminder that we don't have to accept the status quo. We can always question things, explore new ideas, and try to build a better future.
Absolutely. And that's what makes this book and this conversation so fascinating.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, from the national debt to healthcare to education to the environment. We've explored the DOGE directive's vision for a leaner, more efficient government, and we've talked about the potential consequences, both positive and negative.
We've examined their plans for tackling big challenges and leveraging technology to change how government works. We've also looked at some historical examples, and we've considered the different perspectives on this radical vision.
The DOGE directive is a bold vision, and it's sure to continue generating debate and discussion. Whether you agree with it or not, it forces us to ask some important questions about the kind of society we want to live in and the role government should play in our lives.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we encourage you to continue exploring these ideas, read the book, talk to your friends and family, and form your own conclusions.
Thanks for joining us on this journey into the world of the DOGE directive. We hope you found it informative and thought-provoking. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.